The first permanent English settlement along the Chesapeake Bay initially proved to be a bit of a disappointment. The Virginia Company of London, chartered in 1606, was a joint stock company given the right to create colonies in the New World. The company ordered the settlers to look for precious metals or some other resource that would return a profit to the stockholders. What the settlers actually found, in their first settlement at Jamestown, were terrible living conditions and a high mortality rate. Malarial swamps were common along the Chesapeake, and disease claimed many lives. This problem was compounded by basic difficulties the colonists had in just feeding themselves. This reflected the fact that most who initially came to Jamestown were either gentlemen who were unaccustomed to manual labor or unskilled workers who had little knowledge of farming. John Smith, who briefly led the colony, had to force the settlers to grow food to feed themselves, rather than squandering their time searching for non-existent gold and silver. Hoping to attract settlers to their enterprise, the Virginia Company made a number of generous concessions to the colonists. These included allowing them local self-government through an elected assembly, the House of Burgesses, and creating the headright system, under which every colonist who paid for his own passage, or who paid for another's passage, was automatically granted 50 acres of land. During this time, the colonists also finally discovered a viable product to export: tobacco. Yet the colony still teetered on the brink of disaster. Between 1619 and 1621, for instance, the company sent over 4,000 settlers to Jamestown, but by 1622, only 1,200 were still alive. This high mortality rate stemmed not only from disease and malnutrition, but also from conflicts with the local natives. From the beginning, the colony had a troubled relationship with local tribes. When they first arrived, the Confederation of Tribes under Chief Powhatan had offered them assistance and provided them with food. This generosity was not entirely altruistic. Powhatan saw the English settlers as potential allies against rival tribes, and he was not terribly worried about their presence, since the natives greatly outnumbered the English. However, this relationship quickly soured as the settlers took to stealing food and sporadic warfare broke out. In 1622, the Confederation, now under the leadership of Opachacanoe, decided to resolve the issue once and for all with a massive assault upon the English settlements. This attack had killed approximately 1/4 of the English, but the settlers rallied and began a ferocious counter-assault which decimated the natives in turn. This attack proved to be a critical blow for the Virginia Company of London. Faced with this disaster, the British government dissolved the company's charter, and Virginia became a royal colony, directly administered by a governor appointed by the Crown. The royal government did allow the colonists to retain both the House of Burgesses and the headright system, still hoping to lure more settlers to the region. The second major settlement in the Chesapeake region was Maryland, which was not a charter or corporate colony, but rather a grant given to an individual, a proprietary colony. The proprietor or owner in this case was Lord Baltimore. His ambition was to make Maryland a refuge for Catholics, a persecuted religious minority in England. In order to attract settlers, the colony followed Virginia's footsteps in creating a popularly elected assembly and in dispersing headright grants of 50 acres to individuals. Many Catholics did immigrate to this colony, but they remained a distinct minority. In 1649, the Assembly issued the Maryland Toleration Act, which promised equal treatment for all Christians. But Puritan settlers who had migrated to the region led a successful revolt against the proprietor in the 1650s. The government they established outlawed Catholicism. Ultimately, a degree of religious tolerance was re-established, but Catholics continued to suffer from significant legal disabilities, as they did in England at this time. In the early 17th century, family life in both Virginia and Maryland was very unstable. Most settlers came as indentured servants, who couldn't even think of beginning a family until their term of service was up. Planters also typically preferred servants who were male, and thus able to do heavy agricultural work, leading to a severe gender imbalance. Even when they were freed, there was no guarantee that men would be able to find a spouse. Compounding these problems was the very high mortality rate in this region. Creating a stable family environment proved difficult in an age where it was all too common for children to lose one or both of their parents well before they were adults. The fragmented and individualistic character of life in the Chesapeake region can be seen as well in settlement patterns. Rather than clustering closely together in villages or towns, settlers in this region favored isolated farms and plantations. Unlike colonists in New England, the settlers in the Chesapeake were typically not bound together by a strong shared religious vision or a sense of common purpose. Most came simply seeking economic security as individuals. This also led settlers in the region to restlessly push further and further into the interior in search of new and more fertile land. As one observer wrote in 1705, quote, "This liberty of taking up land and the ambition of each man has of being a lord of a vast though unimproved territory, together with the advantage of many rivers which afford a commodious road for shipping at every man's door, has made the country fall into such an unhappy settlement in the course of trade, that to this day they have not any one place of cohabitation among them that may reasonably bear the name of a town." Unquote. Robert Beverly, The History of Virginia. While settlers going to the Chesapeake were typically seeking their fortunes, those who originally went to New England were seeking salvation. England had become Protestant during the 1500s with the creation of the Church of England, also known as the Anglican Church, which was headed by the king rather than the Pope in Rome. Some Englishmen, however, believed that the Anglican Church was still tainted with the remnants of Catholicism and needed to be further purified. The Puritan viewpoint was not well received by English monarchs, who saw it as challenging their religious and secular authority. And at the beginning of the 17th century, James I and Charles I proved particularly hostile. Growing persecution helped push many English Puritans to seek their fortunes elsewhere. Two groups provided the first waves of settlement for New England. The Pilgrims were separatists who despaired of ever reforming English society. They had first fled to Holland, but quickly became alarmed when their children began to be assimilated into Dutch society and to lose their faith. Seeking to find a place where they could sustain the purity of their doctrines in isolation, they set sail for the Americas, and in the fall of 1620 ended up far north of Virginia in what became known as the Plymouth Colony. The second wave of immigrants came in 1629 when a group of Puritans established the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Unlike the Pilgrims, these Puritans did believe they could ultimately change English society. They hoped that by establishing a model religious community in the American wilderness, they could help inspire this change. Initially, New England suffered from fewer conflicts with Native Americans than what we saw in the southern colonies. In part, this reflected the fact that the native populations had already been decimated by European diseases well before the Pilgrims and the Puritans had arrived. This ensured that there was plenty of open land for the settlers, and relatively little competition for land and resources with the natives. Indeed, Native Americans often aided the new settlers by teaching them how to survive in this strange new country. Nonetheless, conflicts did emerge. Between 1636 and 1637, for instance, the colonists fought a ferocious war against the Pequot tribe. Aided by other tribes, the English colonists virtually annihilated the Pequot, selling those that were left into slavery. The people who came to New England were quite different than those who went to the Chesapeake. Settlers in the South were typically either aristocrats, looking to create landed estates, or, more commonly, unskilled laborers who were forced to sell themselves as indentured servants. Only about 1/5 of the migrants to New England came as indentured servants. Most were fairly prosperous middle-class farmers, shop owners, and skilled workers who could buy their own passage, indicating again that their primary motivation for immigrating was religious, not economic. These settlers also often came as entire families, and indeed entire communities, in contrast to the single males who provided most of the settlers in the Chesapeake. This fact, combined with the healthy climate and the relatively low levels of initial conflict with native tribes, ensured rapid population growth and stable families.